Confucius. As education and literacy spread in China and scholars became influential as ministers of rulers, philosophers also began to flourish. In the late 6th century BC, two of the greatest philosophers of all time emerged in China, Lao Tzu, the founder of Taoism, and Confucius, whose philosophy and religion came to dominate China for more than 2 millennia. Confucius is the Latinized form of Kung Fu, which means Kung, the master. Confucius was born in the small state of Lu in 551 BC and died in 479, living during the time of turmoil, political intrigue, and numerous small wars in the last part of the Spring and Autumn era. Assassinations, bribery, adultery, and other crimes were common, even though punishments were severe. In Lu, 3 families contended for the hereditary rulership, while numerous educated aristocrats sought positions in the government, and many suffered poverty. Confucius was brought up as a gentleman who took up music, archery, and fishing, although he said he fished without a net and would not shoot at a bird at rest. He was so absorbed in music that he once did not know the taste of meat for 3 months. He also learned to do practical jobs of humble people, such as keeper of the stores and head of the pastures. However, most of the time, Confucius was not able to find an official position, though he was willing to do anything that did not involve wrongdoing. Perhaps it was his ethical concerns that prevented him from being useful to the rulers of his time. Instead, he occupied his time in what he loved the most, the pursuit of learning. By the age of 15, Confucius had set his heart on learning. By 30, he felt that he was firmly established. At 40, he was no longer confused. By 50, he had a sense of mission in following the will of heaven. At 60, he was at ease with whatever he heard, and when he was 70, he felt he could do whatever he liked without violating moral principles. No single teacher had a great influence on Confucius, as he tried to learn from everyone. His model, however, was the ancient Duke of Zhou, who helped to establish the Zhou dynasty. The spiritual connection he felt with the ancient duke is indicated by his regret once that it had been a long time since he had dreamed of the Duke of Zhou. Confucius studied thoroughly the classics of history, poetry, propriety, and especially the Book of Changes, I Ching. He believed that if he could spend 50 years studying changes, he might yet be free of great mistakes. Confucius became an orphan at an early age. He married and had a son and a daughter, and he also took care of his older brother who was crippled. Confucius claimed little for himself, except that he never neglected proper mourning, nor was he ever overcome by wine. Confucius was perhaps the first professional teacher of adults we know of in China. He accepted any student who brought any gift at all, even if they were poor. When he was 50, Confucius was finally given a position in the government, though his advice was not often valued. He advised Ji Kongzu, who became head of the ruling families, to show piety toward his parents and kindness toward his children, promote the worthy, and train the incompetent. Here we see the important emphasis on education and ability rather than heredity. Several of Confucius' students did attain important positions in government, as Confucius recommended Zi Le Lu for efficiency, Zi Kung for understanding, and Zhan Chu for versatility. In his late 50s, Confucius used the ceremonial impropriety to leave Lu so that he could see if other states might put his principles into practice. In Wei, he was not afraid to meet with the notorious Nanzi, a woman involved in incest, adultery, and political intrigue. When the Duke of Wei asked his advice on military strategy, Confucius declared that he had knowledge of sacrificial vessels, but had not studied warfare. The next day, he left Wei and went to Chen. While he was traveling through Sung, Huan Tui, the Sung minister of war, tried to have him assassinated. But Confucius said, "Heaven produced the virtue that is in me. What do I have to fear from such a one as Huan Tui?" This did not prevent Confucius from accepting Huan Tui's brother, Sima Nu, as a student, although Sima Nu did renounce his dastardly brother. Confucius was also trapped at Kuang and thought his favorite student, Yan Hui, was dead. When they got to Chen, they were weak and short of supplies. The Duke of Chen was involved in war at the time, but Confucius did speak with the Minister of Crime about propriety before going back to Lu, because he was concerned that his students were becoming headstrong and careless. The only ruler who seemed to agree with Confucius that virtue was important was the Duke of She, in the small state of Tsai. He was invited there once, but Zhu Lu pointed out they were in rebellion then, and what would people think? So Confucius decided not to go, though he felt like a gourd that was only fit to hang up, but not to eat. Confucius also rejected an offer in a similar situation from the Bi castle, even though he believed that he might be able to make a Zhou in the West. Confucius returned to Wei to advise the Prime Minister Kung Yu, who was willing to listen to him. Kung forced one of his nobles to divorce his wives to marry his daughter. But when he kept a concubine, and Kung asked Confucius how to attack him, Confucius told him not to attack. When Kung went ahead anyway, Confucius prepared his chariot to leave. Kung apologized, and Confucius was ready to change his mind. But then messengers arrived from Lu, inviting him to return to his home state. Confucius spent his last 5 years in Lu, and once Zhang Xu was sent by Ji Kongsu to ask the master's opinion about raising taxes. Confucius stood with the people against this. And when Zhang Xu collected the increased taxes, Confucius declared that he was no disciple of his. Although Confucius did advise Duke Ai to support the common people, advance the upright, and punish a usurper, he was ignored and felt that he never really had a chance to show what he could do. In addition to teaching, Confucius is credited with editing the Book of Odes and the Spring and Autumn Annals, revising the music and ceremonies, and writing commentaries on the Book of Changes. The main source of his teachings, which describes his conversations with his students, is the Analects, Lun Yu, which was apparently written by his students. From these accounts, we can see not only what Confucius taught, but how he taught and what his attitudes and manner was like. He was said to be free of having foregone conclusions, dogmatism, obstinacy, and egotism. His manner was affable but firm, commanding but not harsh, while he was polite and completely at ease. Zhu Gung said Confucius could get information in a foreign state by being cordial, frank, courteous, temperate, and deferential. Zhu Gung adds that this was not the way inquiries were usually made. Confucius had a gentle sense of humor and did not mind being corrected by his own students. Confucius was particularly respectful of those in mourning and made filial piety, or respect for one's parents, a cardinal virtue. He said, "In serving his father and mother, a man may gently remonstrate with them, but if he sees that he has failed to change their opinion, he should resume an attitude of deference and not thwart them, may feel discouraged, but not resentful." Confucius cared most about people and was perhaps the first great humanist in history. When the stables burned down, he asked if any person had been hurt, but did not inquire about the horses. He recognized the free will of every individual, believing that the commander of 3 armies could be removed, but the will of even a common man could not be taken away. He spoke of the way, the Tao, as when he said, "In the morning hear the way, in the evening die content." Yet he believed that it was humans who made the way great, not the way that made humans great. Confucius believed that he could even live among the barbarians, because virtue never dwells alone, it will always bring good neighbors. He believed that a gentleman should help the needy, not make the rich richer still. Confucius criticized Yuan Su for rejecting his salary of 900 measures of grain as governor because he could have given it to his neighbors. Confucius never gave up and believed that he was serving by being filial, even if he was not in the government. He never expected to meet a faultless person, but hoped that he might meet someone of fixed principles, even though he saw many examples of nothing pretending to be something. He greatly disliked sham and deceit. He felt he could not stoop to clever talk, a pretentious manner, and a reverence that was only of the feet. He could not bear to see high offices filled with men of narrow views, ceremonies performed without reverence, and mourning forms observed without grief. He hated seeing sharp mouths overturning states and clans. Confucius believed that his mission was to spread the culture that had been passed on to him by King Wen. And trusting that this was the will of heaven, he did not even fear an assassin. He must have believed in prayer because he said that whoever turns away from heaven has no one to pray to. He hoped that even if he was not recognized in the world, he would be known in heaven. When Confucius became ill, some of his students dressed up as retainers, but the master reprimanded them for this pretense, because he knew he could not deceive heaven. He preferred to die in the arms of his disciples anyway. Although he believed there were others as honest as himself, Confucius felt that no one loved learning as much as he did. Any situation could be a lesson. When walking with others, he could emulate the good qualities he saw in others and correct the bad qualities in himself. Confucius did not believe himself to be a sage or even perfectly virtuous, but he did claim unwearying effort to learn and unflagging patience in teaching others. Confucius believed that people were similar by nature but became different by practice, and thus there are some one can join in study, others one can join in progress along the way, others again beside whom one can take one's stand, and finally some whom one can join in counsel. Teachings of Confucius. Confucius was willing to teach and learn with anyone who came to him. Once he even accepted an uncapped youth, though he stated that he was not responsible for what the youth did when he left. He once struck a man who was waiting for him in a sprawling position in the shins with his staff, declaring that youths who show no respect for their elders achieve nothing, and those who merely get older are useless pests. He observed that one youth seemed to be more interested in growing up quickly than in proving himself. He expected his students to desire learning and think for themselves. As long as the student was making effort, regardless of his progress, he would help him. He even encouraged them to compete with him in goodness. However, he found that most of them were looking for the rewards of a career. He was glad when students stayed with him rather than accepting the first position offered, though he did emphasize that the model sayings were to be carried out in practice. The rational Confucius did not act without knowing why. He heard much and selected what is good to follow, calling it the second type of knowledge. He once spent a whole day meditating without food and all night without sleep, but found that it was better for him to learn. Confucius thought of himself as a transmitter of the ancient culture, not a creator of new ideas. He held nothing back from his students and consulted with them as friends on every step. Yet he realized it is useless to speak of higher things to those who are below average. Listening silently and learning and teaching untiringly were natural to Confucius. The thought that I have not properly cultivated virtue, that what is learned has not been thoroughly discussed, that knowing what is right I have not moved toward it, that what is wrong I have not been able to change, these are the things which bother me. Confucius observed and related to the individual characteristics of his students, but he did not know if any of them were truly good. When Tzu Kung quoted back to the master his version of the Golden Rule, "What I do not want others to do to me, I do not want to do to them," Confucius pointed out he had not lived up to that yet, because he was often criticizing others. Confucius said Tzu Kung was fortunate to have time for that, but he himself did not. Confucius usually brought issues back around to self-knowledge and self-improvement. When the ruler Ji Kongsu complained about all the thieves, Confucius said that if he were free of desire, they would not steal even if he paid them. Asked about the treatment of parents, Confucius gave 4 different answers to 4 men, recommending obedience, behavior that does not make the parents anxious, sincere feeling of respect, and proper demeanor. Questions and answers enabled Confucius to refine his teachings. He differentiated the good and the wise. The good love people, are tranquil like water, and enjoy long life. The wise know people, are active, delighting in mountains, and enjoy happiness. When asked if injury should be repaid with virtue, Confucius said that injury should be repaid with justice, so that virtue could be repaid with virtue. When asked about the true gentleman, Confucius said that he cultivates himself carefully so as to help other people. In government, one ought to lead by example and work hard for the people. Honesty and sincerity were essential for Confucius, and he insisted on the correct use of language. Yet a lazy student helped Confucius himself to learn that he must not only listen to what people say, but also watch to see what they do. He suggested caution in speech. Do not be too ready to speak of it, lest the doing of it should prove to be beyond your powers. Yet Confucius often used metaphors to express his meaning, and liked to quote poetry as well. When the bold and daring Zulu asked him whom he could take with him to command an army, Confucius replied, "Not the man who is ready to attack a tiger barehanded or swim across a river, not caring whether he lived or died, but I should take someone who approaches difficulties with due caution, who likes to plan precisely and carry it out." The brash Zulu could not believe the answer of Confucius, that the first measure in administering a government is to correct the language. So Confucius explained that if what is said is not in accordance with the truth of things, affairs cannot be carried to success. Propriety in music will not flourish, and punishments will go astray. When punishments go astray, people do not know how to move hand or foot. The Analects concludes with a statement by Confucius that a gentleman must understand the will of heaven, the rules of propriety, and be able to understand words in order to understand people. Confucius liked to use the examples of men to illustrate his lessons. He often referred to the legendary emperors Yao, Shun, and Yu to show how one could rule virtuously. He also admired those who humbly refused the sovereignty and renounced violence despite their sufferings. He cited the historical examples of Duke Wen of Jin for rising to an emergency but not following propriety, and Duke Huan of Qi for following propriety but failing in an emergency. Confucius credits Guan for helping Duke Huan to unite the state's rulers without using war chariots, but he still did not necessarily consider him good. Yet, if it had not been for Guan, they might be folding their clothes in the manner of the barbarians. In history, as in personal life, Confucius tended to focus on the ethical questions. In his own time, he felt that one change could bring Qi to the level of Lu, and a single change would bring Lu to the way. He believed that the common people could be made to follow the way, even if they were not able to understand it. He pointed out the virtues of ministers, but never found anyone who was truly steadfast. Confucius believed that if the people were led by governmental measures that kept order by laws and punishments, they would try to avoid them, but would lose all self-respect. Yet, if they were led by virtue, with order kept by propriety, they would keep their self-respect and set themselves right. Confucius observed that if one's actions were motivated by profit, one would have many enemies. Confucius did not like competition and pointed out that even after an archery match, the contenders were gentlemen at the drinking bout afterward. He believed that the ancients studied for self-improvement, but that now people learn in order to impress people. The goal of education for Confucius was not merely to get a salary, nor was it to learn and remember as many things as possible. He said there was a thread which runs through all his teachings. The single saying he believed could be practiced all the time was the saying about consideration known as the golden rule, of not doing to others what you do not want them to do to you. Confucius was said to have taught culture, conduct, loyalty, and truthfulness. Through culture, one may be stimulated by poetry, established in character by the rules of propriety, and perfected by music. The extensive study of literature helps one not to violate the way. However, before culture came moral education. Confucius said, "Set your heart upon the way, support yourself by its virtue, rely on goodness, find recreation in the arts." After a youth had learned to behave well toward parents and elders, to be cautious in giving promises and punctual in keeping them, to overflow in love to all, and to cultivate the friendship of the good, if one had energy to spare, then the cultural arts could be studied. A passage from the later text of the Liqi has Confucius explaining the values of studying each of the classics, as well as the dangers of superficial exposure. When one is kind and gentle and simple-hearted, and yet not ignorant, we may be sure one is deep in the study of poetry. When one is broad-minded and acquainted with the past, and yet not filled with incorrect legends or stories of events, we may be sure one is deep in the study of history. When one is generous and shows a good disposition, and yet not extravagant in one's personal habits, we may be sure one is deep in the study of music. When one is quiet and thoughtful and shows a sharp power of observation, and yet is not crooked, we may be sure that one is deep in the study of philosophy. When one is humble and polite and frugal in one's personal habits, and yet not full of elaborate ceremonies, we may be sure one is deep in the study of propriety. And when one is cultivated in speech, ready with expressions and analogies, and yet is not influenced by the picture of the prevailing moral chaos, we may be sure that one is deep in the study of the spring and autumn annals. Poetry not only stimulated the mind, but Confucius also said it helped self-contemplation, taught the art of sociability, showed how to regulate feelings of resentment, and from it one learned the duties of serving parents and the ruler, as well as the names of birds, beasts, and plants. For Confucius, propriety enabled the ancient kings to establish harmony and beauty. Without propriety, courtesy becomes tiresome, caution becomes timidity, daring insubordination, and straightforwardness rudeness. It was better to be sparing than extravagant in ceremonies, and funerals were to be observed with deep sorrow, not fear. A gentleman properly blends substance and refinement, for too much of the first is rude, and of the latter pedantic. Yet Confucius believed that anyone who followed the rules of propriety completely would be thought a sycophant. Confucius always kept in mind the practical goals of education. He asked if one could recite the 300 odes, but did not know how to act in government or answer specific questions on a mission. Of what use was extensive knowledge? The first step is for one to correct one's own conduct. Then one may assist in governing others. But if one cannot rectify oneself, how could one ever rectify others? Wisdom may bring one into power, but goodness is needed to secure that power. Without dignity, one will not be respected by the common people, and the rules of propriety must also be followed. With sincere faith and the love of learning, one should not be afraid to die in pursuing the way. Dangerous and chaotic states should be avoided. If the way does not prevail, it is better to hide, and the wealthy and honored ought to be ashamed. When the way does prevail, one may show oneself and be bold in speech and action. When Shi Gongse asked Confucius if he should kill those who do not have the way, the master said, "You are there to rule, not to kill. If you desire what is good, the people will be good." In loving their children and people, parents and rulers must exact some effort from them. And in being loyal to parents and rulers, children and the people should not refrain from admonishing the object of their loyalty. In addition to attending strictly to business and punctually observing promises, Confucius said an administrator is economical in expenditure, loves the people, and uses the peasant's labor only at the proper seasons of the year. Though religious, Confucius rarely discussed supernatural phenomena or spirits. Until one has learned to serve humans, how can one serve ghosts, he asked. Till one knows about the living, how can one know about the dead? Nevertheless, when he did offer sacrifices to his ancestors, he felt their spirits were present. Like Lao Tzu, Confucius believed in following the way. How else could one get out of the house except through the door, or find one's way into the inner room? Knowing the way leads to loving it, and loving it to taking delight in it. The Chinese word for virtue, de, implies power, and something that can be built up within oneself. Confucius said he never found anyone whose desire for virtue was as strong as the sexual desire for beauty. Virtue can be gained by doing the work first before considering the reward, and by attacking the evil within oneself rather than the evil in others. One of the great threats Confucius saw to virtue was the confusion of clever talk. Just as small impatiences can ruin great projects. For Confucius, the good are never unhappy, the wise never confused, and the brave never afraid. Courage, however, must not take priority over justice, or else an aristocrat would become an insurgent and a common person a thief. The higher knowledge of wisdom is to know when one knows something and when one does not. Whoever learns but does not think is lost, but whoever thinks but does not learn is in danger. Love of learning is essential to the virtues, and Confucius explained how love of the 6 virtues can degenerate without the love of learning. Love of goodness degenerates to simple-mindedness, love of knowledge to lack of principle, love of faithfulness to injurious disregard of consequences, love of uprightness to harshness, love of courage to insubordination, and love of strong character to mere recklessness. People's characters can be penetrated by looking at their aims, how they pursue them, and what brings them content. Yet the ultimate value of observing others is to learn how to equal those of worth and to examine the faults of others in ourselves. Confucius said he never found a single person who could see one's own faults and bring the charge against oneself. To have faults and not be trying to correct them is really to have faults. Confucius advised people not to be afraid of admitting mistakes and amending their ways. He recommended friendships with the upright, sincere, and well-informed, but warned against those who flatter, have weak principles, and talk cleverly. Beneficial pleasures are studying ceremonies and music, discussing good points in others' conduct, and having many wise friends. Detrimental are profligate enjoyments, idle gadding about, and feasting. Confucius taught the middle way between extremes in regard to most virtues, and considered moderation transcendent and rare in his time. Lavishness may lead to presumption and frugality to meanness, though the latter is a less serious fault. The Confucian middle way was later elaborated on in the treatise called The Doctrine of the Mean, or the Center of Harmony, Zheng Yung. The greatest concept of virtue for Confucius was ren, which has been translated here as goodness, but also means humanity, or human-heartedness. A good person does not worry about not being known by others, but rather seeks to know them. The good know how to like and dislike people, although the one whose heart is set on goodness would dislike no one, according to Confucius. Without goodness, one cannot endure adversity for long, nor enjoy prosperity for long. The good are also courageous, but the brave are not necessarily good, just as the virtuous are eloquent, though the eloquent may not be virtuous. Confucius observed that faults fell into patterns, and that one looked for faults only in order to recognize goodness. Confucius said he did not know whether Zheng Yung was good, but he saw no need for him to be a good talker. Confucius felt that goodness meant courtesy in private life, diligence in public life, and loyalty in relationships. The good establish their own character and then help others to establish theirs. To be able to see others by what is within ourselves, Confucius called the art of goodness. And a ruler who could benefit the people and bring salvation to all, he called a divine sage. The Chinese term junzi originally meant the son of a ruler and thus an aristocrat. But in the time of Confucius, and perhaps due to his influence, it came to imply a moral quality and has been translated as a superior man or a gentleman. Thus, one could attain high social status through moral and educational development. For Confucius, a good man was always a gentleman, but not all gentlemen were good. A gentleman considers loyalty and faithfulness fundamental and is not afraid of correcting his mistakes. We must acknowledge that as a male term, this does indicate sexism, which seems to have been the case since there is no evidence that Confucius had any female students, though he did speak to the notorious Nansu. For Confucius, the main concern for the gentleman was self-improvement. He is distressed at his own lack of capacity, never at the failure of others to recognize his merits. Confucius warned that the gentleman should guard against lust when one's physical powers are not settled, strife when they are full of vigor, and avarice when they are declining. A gentleman's 9 cares are to see clearly, hear distinctly, be kind in looks, respectful in manner, sincere in words, and diligent in work. When in doubt, he asks for information. When angry, he considers the consequences. And when he sees a chance for gain, he considers whether the pursuit would be right. A gentleman is cautious with words and diligent in action, lest his words outrun his deeds. The superior person does not promote someone merely because of what one says, nor does one reject sayings because of who said them. Sometimes Confucius contrasted the superior person to the inferior. The superior sets one's heart on virtue, the inferior on comfort. The superior thinks of sanctions, the inferior of favors. The superior person looks at the question from all sides without bias. The inferior is biased and can see only one point of view. The superior are not for or against anything, but follow what is right. The inferior understand only profit. The gentleman calls attention to the good points in others. The small person points out their defects. A gentleman makes demands on himself. The small person makes them on others. The superior people can influence those above them, but the inferior only those below them. The gentleman is calm and at ease. The inferior frets and is ill at ease. The gentleman is dignified but not proud. The inferior are proud but not dignified. For Confucius, the gentleman thinks of the way and its progress, not how he is going to make a living. He warns against dehumanization, saying that a gentleman is not an implement. A gentleman considers justice essential, practices propriety, is modest and faithful. A gentleman acts before he speaks, and then speaks according to his action. Confucius warned against hypocrisy when he said that one with clever words in a pretentious manner is seldom good. He did not consider himself truly good, wise, or courageous. He said he was not concerned that he had no office, only that he make himself qualified for one. Confucius believed that a gentleman can withstand want, only a small person is swept away by it. Rather than give up his principles, Confucius could be satisfied with coarse rice to eat, water to drink, and a bent arm for a pillow. He considered wealth and honor obtained through injustice to be as remote from him as clouds in the sky. Confucius claimed that he could try a civil suit as well as anyone, but that it was better to bring it about so that there are no civil suits. Not given the opportunity to put his teachings into practice on a large scale, Confucius learned and taught others instead. As one of the most influential ethical teachers in history, the results of those teachings have been immeasurable. Followers of Confucius. Once a border guard at Yi asked to see Confucius, because he was always allowed to see any true gentleman who was passing by. After talking with Confucius, he told the disciples not to be disheartened at their master's lack of office, because the way has not prevailed in the world for a long time. Yet he prophesied that heaven was going to use their master as a bell with a wooden tongue. Confucius praised Yan Hui, who lived from 521 to 481 BC, more than any of his students for his cheerfulness in poverty and his mind's attention to goodness. Yan Hui never said much, but the master knew he was not stupid from the quality of his conduct. Unfortunately, Yan Hui died at a young age, and Confucius felt that no others were really fond of learning. Ji Gongsu became head of the administration of Lu in 492 and asked Confucius if Zhu Lu, Zhu Gung, and John Chu were fit for office. The master recommended each of them. Zhu Lu, who lived from 542 to 480, appointed a student Confucius considered slow as a steward, and the master said that it would ruin him. Zhu Lu replied that one does not have to study books to be learned, to which Confucius responded that such talk made him detest glib talkers. Confucius predicted that the bold and daring Zhu Lu would not die in bed, and in fact, he bravely refused to flee Wei in loyalty to the Kung family and was killed there, trying to save the prince who had hired him. Confucius said that John Chu, who was born in 522, could be charged with the duty of managing the military levies of a town with 1,000 households, or a family of 100 chariots, but he could not say whether he was good. Confucius advised John Chu to act immediately because he had a tendency to hold himself back. Yet he cautioned Zhu Lu against immediate action because he tended to be rash. When John Chu collected higher taxes for the wealthy Qi family, Confucius had him drummed out of his circle of students. John Chu continued to serve the Qi family successfully for many years. Zhu Gung, born in 520 BC, was eloquent, and Confucius described him as a sacrificial vessel of jade. In 487 BC, a rebellion in Qi led to some families attacking Lu. Confucius refused permission to Zhu Lu and two others to go out to Qi, but granted the request of Zhu Kung. Zhu Kung persuaded Tian Chang that because of the probable rebellion, it would be better for him to attack the stronger state of Wu rather than the weaker state of Lu. Zhu Kung then went to the king of Wu and convinced him to attack Qi without fearing Yue, because he went there to get Yue to join Wu in the attack on Qi. Zhu Kung then went to Jin to warn them to be prepared for an attack from Wu if they defeated Qi. This all came to pass, but then Yue launched a surprise attack on Wu, killed their king and prime minister, and by 470 BC had become protector. Although in a few years all these states in Lu were undone, Zhu Kung had preserved Lu for a while. Zhu Kung was one of the first to go from state to state persuading rulers which policy to follow, a practice that became common in the ensuing warring states period. Zhu Kung also became wealthy buying and selling in accordance with market changes, and was once prime minister in Lu and Wei before he died in Qi. Zhu Kung is an example of a common man who rose to fame and wealth through education and his own abilities. According to Mencius, after Confucius died, Zhu Kung went back to the religious sanctuary near his master's grave, built a house, and mourned for an additional 3 years after the traditional 3-year mourning period, showing himself to be perhaps the most devoted disciple. Tseng Shen, who lived from 505 to 436 BC, was described as dull-witted by Confucius. And Mencius wrote that when his house was going to be attacked, he ordered his steward not to let anyone stay in the house because he did not want the plants and trees harmed. Tseng was obviously not the humanist that Confucius was, and he seems to have emphasized filial piety even more than the master. The classic of filial piety is often attributed to him. Tseng refused to join other disciples in rendering the same respect to Yu Zhou that they had given to Confucius, even though he and Yu Zhou were the only others besides Confucius to be referred to as masters in the Analects. Confucius considered Zhu Yu, who lived from 506 to 443 BC, well-versed in culture and learning. Though once when he heard Zhu Yu singing and playing a string instrument, he said in jest that it was not necessary to use an ox cleaver to kill a chicken. Zhu Yu replied that a gentleman learns from the way to be kind, while an inferior person becomes easier to command. When Zhu Yu was warden of the castle of Wu, Confucius asked him if he got hold of the right people there. Later, Zhu Yu criticized the school of Zhu Xia, lived from 507 to 425, for practicing unimportant things like sprinkling and sweeping the ground, answering summons, replying to questions, and coming forward and retiring. Zhu Xia defended his method of education by saying that the way of a gentleman must not be transmitted before the student is ready. Confucius once found that he could discuss the odes with Zhu Xia, but in evaluating him, he said Zhu Xia had not reached worthiness yet. Confucius told Zhu Xia to practice the Ju of the gentleman, not that of the common people. The original meaning of this term, Ju, is unclear. Whaley suggests that it may have meant unwarlikeness, in contrast to the cowardice of the inferior. Eventually, this was the term that was used to refer to the followers of the Confucian philosophy. In the first chapter of the Analects, Zhu Xia is quoted as saying that one who treats betters as betters, serves father and mother with all his strength, and his prince with his life, and with his friends, is true to his word, may be called educated. Zhu Chang, who lived from 503 to 447, was from a humble family in Lu, studied with Confucius, and traveled with him in spite of the difficulties. He wrote one of the master's maxims down on his sash so as to always have it with him. The writing down of Confucius' teachings in the Analects is what enabled his philosophy to be passed on, but the authorship of that work is unknown. The historian Sima Qian lists the names of 77 disciples of Confucius that he did not consider dubious. Though there is no indication that Confucius ever spoke to great crowds, it is clear that his teachings took hold among some devoted disciples. A document from the 3rd century BC lists the names of 6 men who improved their lives through education. 2 had studied with Confucius, 1 with Zhu Xia, and 2 with Motsu. Confucian tradition credits Zhu, the grandson of Confucius, with writing the Tashua, higher education, and the Zhongyun, center of harmony. But there is no evidence these texts appeared for at least 2 centuries. The excellence of these 2 short texts in the Li Qi was so recognized by Neo-Confucian scholars of the 12th century that they made them 2 of the 4 Confucian classics, along with the Analects and the Book of Mencius. And for 6 centuries, they were the basis of civil service examinations. These texts are the Tashua, which has been translated as the Great Learning, and which I call higher education because it means learning for adults, and the Zhongyun, which has been translated as the Doctrine of the Mean and Central Harmony, and which I call the Center of Harmony. The first part of the Tashua is attributed to Confucius, and scholars divide on the authorship of the commentary and editing between the disciple Zhengsu and the grandson of Confucius, Zhu, who is also generally considered the author of the Zhongyun. The Tashua begins with the 3 aims of the way of learning as manifesting clear character, loving the people, and living in the highest good. These enable one to achieve directing purpose, calm clarity, peaceful poise, careful deliberation, and success. The 8 steps begin with the investigation of things and proceed to extending knowledge, a sincere will, setting the heart right, cultivating the personal life, making families harmonious, government orderly, and result in peace of the world. Cultivating the personal life is considered the root. Such is the essential text attributed to the great Confucius. In the commentary, Confucius is quoted as saying that he could handle litigations as well as anyone, but what is needed is for people not to have litigations at all. Making the will sincere means not allowing any self-deception. Thus, the best people always watch over themselves when they are alone. Zheng-Su said that wealth may make a house shine, but virtue makes a person shine. Saying that cultivation of the personal life depends on rectifying the mind means that when one is affected by anger, fear, fondness, worries, and anxiety, the mind will not be correct. One must cultivate the personal life in order to regulate the family, or else one will be partial toward those they love, dislike, fear, revere, pity, and respect. Few in the world know what is bad in those they like and what is good in those they dislike. The family must be regulated before the state can be governed, because no one who cannot teach his own family can teach others. When families become good and compliant, then the whole state will become so. Yet, when one man becomes greedy, the whole country will be disordered. A gentleman must have good qualities in himself before he can require them in others. No one who does not have altruism oneself can teach other people. When the ruler treats the elders with respect and the young with compassion, then the people will be aroused to filial piety and find peace in the world. Virtue is the root that produces the fruit of wealth. Yet when wealth is gathered in the ruler's hand, the people will scatter away from him. But when wealth is scattered, they will gather around him. Evil words uttered will be uttered back to one. When wealth is acquired in an evil way, it will be taken away in an evil way. But when the ruler loves humanity, the people will love justice and carry the affairs of the state to completion. The center of harmony, Zhongyun, which is influenced by mystical Taoism, begins by defining human nature as what is given by heaven, which, when followed, is called the way. Cultivating the way is education. The best people look into their hearts and watch the unseen and apprehend the unheard. Before the feelings of pleasure, anger, sorrow, and joy are aroused, one is in what is called the center. When these feelings are aroused and attain their due measure and degree, it is called harmony. The center is the supreme foundation of the universe, and harmony is its universal expression. When the center and harmony are fully realized, order and happiness abound in heaven and earth, and everything flourishes. Confucius said that the best people always maintain the center, but others do not watch the center in their hearts. The smart go beyond it. The stupid do not come up to it. Confucius regretted that the way was not being pursued. The legendary Emperor Shun avoided the extremes and found the center. Confucius also saw the good embraced by his student Hui. Even when states are put in order, honors and rewards are declined, and naked weapons are trampled on, the center of harmony is still not being followed. Only the wise who are in accord with the center of harmony retire from the world and are unknown to their age with no regret. Yet even the wise do not know the way or practice it completely. The way finds its simple beginnings in the relationship between a man and a woman, but in its ultimate extent, it illuminates heaven and earth. For Confucius, the way is not far from people. What is removed from people cannot be considered the way. The best govern people according to human nature. Conscientiousness and reciprocity mean not doing to others what you do not wish them to do to you. The best do what is proper to their position and do not go beyond this. The way is like a long journey that must begin with what is near. In a religious moment, Confucius praises the power of invisible spiritual beings. Next, Confucius praises the founders of the Zhou dynasty for their virtue. The way is cultivated by human goodness, and its greatest expression is in loving relations. Justice is the principle of setting things right, and its greatest expression is honoring the worthy. These two give rise to the rules of propriety. To cultivate their personal lives, rulers must serve their parents and know people, and then they will know heaven. The three universal virtues are wisdom, love, and courage, and the way by which they are practiced is one. These three virtues come from love of learning, practicing vigorously, and a sense of shame. The 9 rules for governing the world, states, and families are cultivating the personal life, honoring the worthy, loving the relatives, respecting the great ministers, identifying oneself with the welfare of all the officers, treating the common people as one's own children, promoting all the useful arts and crafts, being kind to strangers from far countries, and taking interest in the princes of the world. Understanding what is good leads to sincerity, which is the way of heaven. Thinking how to be sincere is the human way and is choosing the good and holding to it. Sincerity may be studied extensively by inquiring into it accurately, thinking it over carefully, discerning it clearly, and practicing it thoroughly. Do not give up, even if it takes 1,000 efforts. Enlightenment results from sincerity. Those who are absolutely sincere develop fully their own nature, the nature of others, and things, and by forming a trinity with heaven and earth, are able to assist in the transforming and nourishing process. This is done by the expression and manifestation of sincerity so that it is full of light, moves others, changes, and transforms them. Absolute sincerity can even foreknow and understand omens. Sincerity completes the self in goodness and things in wisdom, uniting the internal and external. Absolute sincerity is ceaseless, eternal, manifest, infinite, extensive and deep, transcendental and brilliant. By this bridge, the Confucians get to the Taoist way of accomplishing without acting. Yet for the Confucians, the process begins with study and learning and results in respecting the rules of propriety. Confucius is credited with transmitting the ancient doctrines of Yao and Shun, harmonized with the adaptations of Wen and Wu. The Confucians look to the perfectly wise who can rule all people with quick apprehension, intelligence, insight, and wisdom. Embrace all people with greatness, generosity, kindness, and a tender heart. Maintain everything with energy, strength, steadiness, and resolution. Command reverence with balance, seriousness, centeredness, and correctness. And exercise discrimination with order, refinement, concentration, and penetration. The best people of this Confucian ideal expressed in the Jungyung examine their hearts so that nothing is wrong there, and so can observe what others do not see. Be reverent without moving, truthful without speaking, encourage good without rewarding, awe people without showing anger in perfect virtue. Thus we find here a synthesis of Confucian and Taoist philosophy.